when a young girl burst into Jack Mercer's small shop and, in a trembling voice, insisted she believed her father had murdered her mother, he almost brushed it off as a child's fearful exaggeration. But then she mentioned one detail, something so specific and chilling, that every fiber of his being went on alert. In that instant, Jack knew he was no longer dealing with an overactive imagination. He was staring into the panicked eyes of someone desperately needing help. The moment cracked the facade of his quiet life in Brookhaven, unleashing a torrent of danger he never expected to face. Before diving deeper into this story, let everyone share where they're watching from, and if you believe in the power of compassion, hit the like button and subscribe for more. Jack Mercer was known around Brookhaven as a solitary presence, a man who kept mostly to himself. He owned Mercer's Corner Shop, tucked between a small bookstore and a flower shop on Maple Street. The shop was a modest space where he sold groceries, snacks, and odds and ends that people in this sleepy town always seemed to need. He led a predictable routine: rise before sunrise, unlock the shop, greet the early customers, and lock up after the dinner hour, rarely straying far from the well-worn wooden counter where he tallied purchases on a battered old register. At 38 years old, Jack had weathered personal losses that made him value the quiet repetition of life. He had grown used to solitude, used to days blending into each other, and used to living with the weight of unspoken sadness he rarely shared with anyone. On that particular afternoon, Nancy Porter exploded into his world like a firecracker. She was small, only 10 years old, but the look in her eyes made her seem much older. Her hair was dusty brown, disheveled, and tangled around her face, and her cheeks were streaked with tears. She panted hard, as though she had run halfway across town. Jack had been refilling a rack of chips when the door banged open, and he almost dropped the bag in his hand from the sudden noise. Something about the child's terror, so visceral and unguarded, held him in stunned silence. "Please," she cried. "You have to help me. I think my dad killed my mom." Jack stared, certain that she must have made a mistake. People in Brookhaven were not the sort to commit such horrific crimes. This was a town of gentle, neighborly folk. Families lived here for generations, passing down corner homes and the same sturdy values. Yet Nancy's ragged breaths and trembling hands made it clear she believed every syllable. He set the bag of chips aside, feeling his heart thump. "What did you say?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Nancy rushed forward, eyes wide. "I can't go home. I can't ever go back there. Please, you have to listen to me." She grasped at the edge of the counter, struggling to stand upright. Bruises marred her arms, faint shadows of discoloration that made Jack's stomach turn. He found his voice. "Let's sit down." He spoke gently, trying to calm her. He guided her to the folding chair he kept for breaks behind the counter. Nancy collapsed into it. She gazed up at him with raw desperation. Jack recognized the signs of distress. He had seen it only once before, years ago, in the eyes of someone who had walked away from a traumatic event. He had never forgotten that look. He handed her a small bottle of water, his heart in turmoil. Children sometimes had overactive imaginations, but something told him this was no fantasy. "Start from the beginning," he said softly. Nancy took a shaky sip of water. "My dad, Daniel Carter, he's been hitting me for a while now. He used to hurt my mom too. She's been missing for days, and he keeps saying she left us. But that's not true. I saw," her voice wavered, and she looked at him with haunted eyes. "He was in the garage one night. I saw him arguing with her. Then she screamed. And now she's gone. He told me not to talk to anybody." Jack felt an icy realization spread through him. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" "I tried." Nancy sucked in a sharp breath. "But everyone said maybe she just left, that it happens sometimes. They don't believe me. But I know what I saw. I know what he did." A single tear slipped down her cheek, and Jack's heart ached. He glanced around his store. The neon sign in the window flickered, and a single overhead light buzzed softly. His life had been so simple, so compartmentalized until now. Looking at Nancy, he thought of how easily he might have turned her away if she hadn't spoken with such certainty. He could have dismissed her as a runaway with a tall tale. Instead, a sense of responsibility bloomed in his chest. He knelt in front of her so their eyes were level. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "My name is Jack Mercer. We'll figure this out." "How?" she whispered. Her lips trembled, and her small hands gripped the water bottle as though it was a lifeline. Jack's mind raced. He had heard of a capable, compassionate nurse at the local elementary school, Mrs. Bennet, who had once helped a neighborhood boy after a concerning case of neglect. Maybe Mrs. Bennet would know exactly what steps to take. Jack had never personally reached out to Child Protective Services or the police for anyone else's sake. He had always been the one to keep his head down, thinking it was none of his business if families had problems behind closed doors. But in that moment, he saw how a closed door could hide unimaginable horror. He gently lifted Nancy's hand and guided her toward the front of the store. "We're going to find Mrs. Bennet," he said. "She's a school nurse. She'll know what to do." Jack reached for the landline phone but changed his mind. It felt better to handle this in person, without any confusion or delay. Nancy wiped her tears and stood. Her entire body shook, either from exhaustion or fear, or both. Jack grabbed his coat, flipped the sign on the door to closed, and carefully locked up the shop. For a fleeting second, he pictured returning to his store that evening, going about his normal business as though none of this had happened. But he knew, deep down, that normal would never be the same. A child had placed her trust in him, and her eyes told him that the trust was fragile and priceless. They walked quickly through the streets of Brookhaven. The sidewalks were lined with lampposts adorned by the town's seasonal banners, now sporting golden leaves for autumn. Everything looked peaceful, but Jack felt an undercurrent of dread. Nancy walked beside him, her eyes flicking left and right as though she expected her father to appear from behind any corner. She kept close, as if his presence offered some measure of protection. Passers-by gave them curious looks but didn't stop to question anything. At the local school building, most children had gone home for the day, but the front office was still open. Jack pushed through the double doors, ushering Nancy gently inside. A staff member in the lobby raised an eyebrow at their entrance. "I need to speak with Mrs. Bennet," Jack said. "It's urgent." The staff member nodded and led them down a short hallway. They found Mrs. Bennet organizing first aid supplies in a well-lit room that smelled faintly of disinfectant. She was in her mid-50s, with graying hair pinned back from a face that radiated warmth. When she saw Nancy's pale, tear-streaked face, her eyes narrowed with concern. Mrs. Bennet set down a stack of bandages. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. Jack quickly explained, stumbling over his words at first. Nancy clung to his side as he described her terror, her belief that Daniel Carter had done something horrible to her mother. Mrs. Bennet's expression shifted from concern to grim determination. She stepped around the table and placed a gentle hand on Nancy's shoulder. "Honey, come with me," she said. "We're going to get you some help right now. Do you feel safe?" Nancy shook her head. "Not until he's caught," she whispered. Mrs. Bennet nodded. "I'm calling Child Protective Services and the police. And I'm going to make sure you're not anywhere near your father tonight." She turned to Jack. "Thank you for bringing her." Jack's heart pounded. He realized that from this point on, everything would spiral beyond his control. But there was also relief in knowing that a caring adult with experience would step in. Mrs. Bennet picked up her phone and started dialing. Jack could hear the tense conversation as she explained Nancy's account to the authorities. Nancy sat in a chair against the wall, staring at the floor, her breathing shallow. Jack approached her with caution, kneeling at her side again. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. She shrugged. "I don't know. It's all a blur." He offered a ghost of a smile, trying to reassure her with whatever calmness he could muster. "You're very brave for telling the truth. That takes courage. She nodded but didn't speak further. Moments later, the police arrived. A pair of officers stepped into the nurse's office. The older one, Sergeant Jenkins, recognized Jack from around town and gave him a curt nod. He was a tall, imposing figure with lines etched deep around his mouth, a man who had seen too many tragedies in his career. His partner, Officer Wilson, was younger, with kind eyes that drifted toward Nancy. Mrs. Bennett recounted Nancy's story for them, referencing the potential homicide and ongoing abuse. Sergeant Jenkins' expression grew darker with each sentence. He crouched in front of Nancy, speaking gently. "We're going to keep you safe," he said. "Do you have other family or anywhere you can go?" She shook her head. "My grandparents are gone, and my mom's sister lives out of state," she mumbled. "I don't even know if she knows what happened." Sergeant Jenkins reached out and gave her hand a reassuring pat. "We'll get this figured out. We'll place you in a safe home tonight, and we're going to start investigating your father right away." Nancy swallowed. "He'll be angry if he finds out I talked to you." "That's what we're here for," Jenkins said, keeping his tone firm. "He won't be able to get near you." Jack hovered near the doorway, feeling both relief and anxiety. He wondered if he would be asked to give a statement or remain involved. Perhaps the police would let him slip back into anonymity, returning to his shop and letting the social workers take over. Part of him felt guilty for wanting that. Another part of him felt compelled to stay connected to this child, who had chosen him, of all people, for help. That evening, Child Protective Services arranged a temporary foster placement for Nancy, pending a more thorough assessment. Jack signed a brief statement about how Nancy had appeared in his shop, her allegations, and what she had told him. Exhausted by the day's events, he finally trudged back to his place, a small apartment above the shop. Late into the night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by images of Nancy's tears and her father's potential crimes. His mind whirled. Was Daniel Carter truly capable of murder? He had known Daniel vaguely from around town as a gruff, unapproachable man, but never would he have suspected something so violent. The possibility that Sarah, Nancy's mother, might be dead weighed on him. Brookhaven had never faced a tragedy like that in living memory. A few days passed in a haze. Jack busied himself stocking shelves, helping customers, but he couldn't push Nancy's predicament from his mind. He got occasional updates through Mrs. Bennett, who shared that the police had questioned Daniel, but he had vanished the moment the investigation started looking serious. The station had put out a warrant for him, fueling the suspicion that Nancy's accusations were true. People talked in hushed tones around town, speculating about what might have happened to Sarah. Daniel Carter became something of a boogeyman overnight, a figure of darkness in a place where such evils rarely stirred. Gossip spread quickly, and folks who once felt secure now began locking their doors at night. Jack spoke again with Sergeant Jenkins, who confirmed that Daniel was now on the run. "If you see him, call us immediately," Jenkins warned. "He's considered dangerous." Jack nodded, uneasy. Life resumed in a weird limbo as the investigation pressed on. Days turned into weeks, then more than a month. Nancy remained in foster care, though Jack heard she was getting along as well as could be expected under the circumstances. The authorities struggled to find definitive proof of Sarah's fate, but they suspected the worst. That confirmation came one bleak Tuesday afternoon. A local hiker stumbled across human remains in a stretch of woods north of Brookhaven. A ring and personal effects identified the victim as Sarah Carter. The entire town reeled from the news, and the police officially launched a homicide investigation. Jack felt a sharp pang in his chest when he heard. He thought of Nancy, how her world would never be the same again. He found himself walking to the library that day, aimlessly, as if hoping to find some comfort in the dusty shelves. But his mind remained fixed on the child whose greatest nightmare had come true. The police began a manhunt, with posters of Daniel's face plastered across every shop window, gas station, and bus stop. Calls came in from people claiming to have spotted him on highways or in neighboring towns, but each lead went nowhere. In the meantime, Nancy's life was uprooted. She was transferred between foster homes for her own protection. The local media latched onto the story, portraying her as the tragic, brave girl whose accusations had sparked a murder investigation. Jack watched these developments from the perimeter, unsure if he had any role to play beyond what he'd already done. Yet something inside him continued to worry about Nancy. One evening, after closing the shop, he decided to see if he could visit her. He contacted Mrs. Bennet, who had been checking on Nancy from time to time. She gave him the number of the social worker, a well-meaning but overwhelmed individual named Karen Vogel. Karen was initially hesitant about letting Jack see Nancy, fearing it might be disruptive, but Nancy had asked about him, so Karen arranged a supervised meeting at the local social services office. When Jack arrived, Nancy was sitting at a table in the corner, fiddling with crayons and a coloring book. She looked up with a small smile that hinted at relief. He approached slowly. "Hi," he said gently. She set the crayons down and gave a shy wave. "Hi, Jack." Karen observed them from across the room but offered them some space. Jack sat down. "How are you holding up?" She shrugged, eyes shifting. "It's weird. The house I'm in now is nice enough, but I miss my mom." Her voice cracked at the last word. "Nobody understands that she was the only one I really had until everything changed." Jack's heart squeezed. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "I wish I could make it better." Nancy stared at the table. "They said my dad ran away. That he knows the police are after him. Everyone keeps telling me I'm safe, but I don't feel safe. Not with him out there." Jack nodded, wishing he had some comforting phrase. "I understand. It's normal to feel afraid." He paused, uncertain if his next words might be too bold. "I'd like to be your friend if that's okay with you. Someone you can talk to whenever you need." Her lips twitched into something between a smile and a sob. "Really?" He nodded firmly. "Yes. I don't want you to feel alone." Karen walked up then. "You two seem to get along," she remarked, smiling gently. "Nancy, I'm glad you have people in your corner." Nancy took a shaky breath. "He was the only one who believed me right away." A faint blush rose to Jack's cheeks. "I'm just glad you came to me." From that point on, Jack visited Nancy regularly, sometimes bringing little gifts from his shop, cookies, a stuffed animal, or art supplies. She had taken to drawing quietly as a way to soothe her nerve. Her foster parents were a couple in their 50s, the Whitmans. They welcomed Jack's visits, seeing how Nancy brightened when he arrived. The arrangement continued even as the police ramped up efforts to track down Daniel Carter. Weeks of searching led to his capture in another state, a dramatic event that concluded with him arrested at a cheap roadside motel. Footage showed him being led away in handcuffs, eyes wild and brimming with rage. The news spread quickly. Nancy's father was going to stand trial for Sarah's murder. In the following months, the legal process ground forward, slow and meticulous, unearthing every detail of the crime. Nancy had to provide testimony in a closed hearing, a traumatic experience for a 10-year-old. Jack sat with her in the waiting area. She was so small, shoulders trembling with tension. When she returned from the hearing, she buried her face in Jack's chest and wept. He held her gently, tears burning his own eyes as he wondered how much an innocent child could endure. With Nancy's testimony and the forensic evidence, Daniel was found guilty and sentenced to decades in prison. The verdict came as a massive relief for the townspeople of Brookhaven, but especially for Nancy. For the first time since her mother's disappearance, she seemed to grasp that she might never have to face her father again. Her foster family decided to adopt her, seeing how she had bonded with them. She was no longer just a case to them. She was a cherished child who needed stability, love, and understanding to heal the deep wounds inflicted by her father's abuse. Over the next year, Nancy underwent therapy sessions, gradually confronting the nightmares that still haunted her. She was sometimes overwhelmed by memories of her mother's final argument with Daniel, but she found solace in her art, creating bright, hopeful paintings that reflected the life she wished she could have had. Jack visited often, quietly supporting her. He brought new art supplies, canvases, pastels, and watercolor set. Nancy's adoptive parents, Mark and Linda Whitman, welcomed Jack into their home. They saw how Nancy leaned on him, and they appreciated that he never tried to overshadow their role as parent. He was simply there, a comforting presence who had once served as the first line of rescue. Jack found himself opening up as well. Nancy reminded him that there was more to life than solitude. He began to remember why, as a younger man, he had harbored hopes of having a family, before certain tragedies and disappointments had cast him into a shell. He shared small pieces of his past with Nancy, careful not to burden her, but letting her know he too had faced losses. Through these quiet conversations, they formed a bond that was both simple and profound. She came to see him as a protector, a constant in a life that had been so uncertain. Late into the year, Nancy's laughter began to ring more freely through the Whitman household. She found moments of genuine happiness, though shadows of fear still lurked in her eyes. She refused to be alone in a room with the curtains open after dark, frightened by the thought that someone might be watching. She kept a flashlight on her bedside table. She sometimes woke from nightmares, sweating and trembling, convinced Daniel would escape and come for her. Mark and Linda did their best to reassure her, but the fear persisted. One evening, Nancy visited Jack's shop, accompanied by Linda. She wandered the aisles, picking out a few candies, then approached the counter where Jack stood. "I made something for you," she said, a small flush in her cheeks. She slid across a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing of the shop, complete with Jack standing behind the counter, Nancy standing beside him smiling. The sky above was a bright, hopeful blue. Jack swallowed, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," he murmured, placing a hand gently on the drawing. "It's beautiful." Nancy shrugged, trying to seem casual, but he saw the emotion in her eyes. "I wanted you to have something to remind you how grateful I am." He reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'll frame it." In truth, he felt an echo of sorrow beneath the warmth. Part of him feared that no matter how much time passed, the horror of what she experienced would always cling to her. Yet he also believed in her resilience. Little did either of them know that the fear Nancy carried in the back of her mind was about to manifest in the most terrifying way possible. It happened in the middle of a quiet summer night. Daniel Carter, who had been incarcerated in a maximum security prison hundreds of miles away, managed to orchestrate a daring escape. The news jolted the entire state, sending law enforcement agencies into a frenzy. He had overpowered a guard, stolen a vehicle, and disappeared into the night. When Sergeant Jenkins arrived at the Whitmans' doorstep the next morning, his face was grim. "He's out," Jenkins told them bluntly. Nancy stood behind Linda, her eyes wide with shock and dread. "We've got an APB on him in multiple states. We'll do everything in our power to keep you safe." Jack learned of the escape the same morning and rushed to the Whitmans' home. He found Nancy trembling in the living room, a trembling dog clutched in her arms. She couldn't stop pacing. "He's coming for me," she kept saying in a hushed tone, as though expecting him to appear behind her any moment. Linda tried to calm her, but Nancy was inconsolable. "It's going to be okay," Jack tried to reassure her, though his own heart slammed against his ribs. "The authorities will find him." Yet in the back of his mind, Jack couldn't help imagining Daniel as a man driven by rage, seeking to regain control of the daughter who had testified against him. The sense of foreboding was almost too heavy to bear. The police stationed a patrol car outside the Whitman home at all times. They locked the windows, triple-checked the doors. Sergeant Jenkins installed a security system, complete with cameras. Neighbors were alerted. Everyone rallied around Nancy, determined to protect her. But Daniel Carter was cunning, fueled by vengeance, and the possibility of him slipping through the net was terrifyingly real. The tension suffocated the town. Nancy refused to sleep alone. She curled up in Linda's arms, trembling whenever she heard the faintest creak. Mark kept a baseball bat by the door, though he knew that might be futile if Daniel arrived with a gun. Jack spent his evenings with them, sometimes sleeping on their couch just to reinforce the protective circle around Nancy. She found some comfort in his presence, but her eyes remained clouded with fear. One fateful night, Daniel proved just how determined and dangerous he was. Despite the police presence, despite the cameras, he managed to break into the Whitman house by tampering with a back window. He did so with chilling skill and silence. Nancy woke to the sensation of a hand clamped over her mouth. The sight of her father, face twisted with anger, froze her in terror. She couldn't even scream. The next minute was a blur. Linda woke and confronted Daniel in the hall, only to be shoved aside violently. Mark rushed from another bedroom, but Daniel threatened him with a knife, forcing him to back away, eyes filled with helpless rage. Terrified, Nancy tried to fight, but she was small, and Daniel yanked her away before anyone could stop him. A fleeting cry escaped her lips, but the swift commotion scattered the would-be rescuers. By the time Mark and Linda reached the living room, Daniel and Nancy had slipped out into the darkness. A wave of despair ripped through the household. The police officer stationed outside had been found unconscious at his post, evidently ambushed from behind. Chaos ensued, sirens, frantic calls to 911, neighbors pouring out onto their lawns. Jack arrived within minutes, having received a phone call from Linda. His first sight was the shattered Whitman household. Linda's robe was torn, Mark was pacing with tears of fury in his eyes, and Sergeant Jenkins was barking orders to the responding officers, trying to coordinate an immediate search. Jack struggled to breathe. Nancy was gone, snatched by the very monster she had spent a year learning to believe was safely behind bars. For 2 days, no one knew where Daniel had taken her. The entire region buzzed with search efforts. The FBI became involved, scouring roads, forests, abandoned buildings. Every rumor, every half-credible lead was chased down. Anxiety coiled in every conversation. Brookhaven canceled a summer festival that weekend, the mood of the town too heavy for any celebration. Jack barely slept, consumed by nightmares of Nancy alone and terrified. He blamed himself for not being there that night. If only he had insisted on staying over again, maybe he could have stopped Daniel. The guilt gnawed at him. Unknown to everyone, Nancy was held captive in a remote cabin Daniel had found during his flight. The place was deep in the woods near the county line, far from Main Road. He was unstable, raging about betrayal, about how Nancy had dared to testify against him. She was forced to sit on a rickety cot, her wrists bound, tears silently rolling down her cheeks as she listened to him pace and rant, occasionally pounding the walls. He barked at her, "You ruined my life, turned everyone against me." She shuddered, trying to shrink away from his anger. She tried to keep herself from spiraling into despair, remembering everything the Whitmans and Jack had taught her about resilience. But it was so hard. Here she was, living her worst nightmare. The father she had helped lock away was now free, brandishing a battered old revolver and slashing at her psyche with venomous words. Daniel alternated between terrifying threats and deranged justifications for his crimes. He tried to tear down everything Nancy believed about her new family, telling her they would abandon her eventually, just like everyone else. 2 days into the ordeal, the FBI traced Daniel's location after an agent picked up a clue from a gas station attendant who recalled seeing a man matching Daniel's description buying supplies late at night. That lead, combined with a map of possible hideouts in the area, brought them to a rugged back road near an old logging route. With a swarm of law enforcement vehicles, they approached the cabin carefully. Media crews, kept at a distance, filmed the dramatic standoff. By the time Jack got word of the location from Sergeant Jenkins, the standoff was already well underway. The FBI negotiators used megaphones, demanding Daniel surrender. Daniel fired off a shot into the air, screaming obscenities. The air crackled with tension. Nancy, trapped inside, curled into a corner, trembling every time her father's voice rose. She prayed that someone, anyone, would rescue her, but she was also petrified by the possibility of gunfire. The negotiations dragged on for an excruciating hour. Agents tried to coax Daniel into letting Nancy go. He responded by ranting about how the system had stolen his life. The moment came when Daniel's unhinged aggression overpowered any hope of reason. Shots rang out from inside the cabin, bullets whizzing through the rotted wood. Fearing for Nancy's life, the FBI stormed the place. In the chaos, Daniel raised his gun in their direction, refusing to drop it. A flurry of gunfire erupted. When the dust settled, Daniel lay motionless, and Nancy was discovered crouched behind a toppled table, mercifully unhurt aside from bruises and severe shock. It was nearly dusk when they extracted her from the cabin. Nancy emerged shaky and pale, her eyes red from crying. The flicker of relief that spread across her face at the sight of the police was heartbreaking. A paramedic rushed to check her, gently guiding her to an ambulance. News cameras flashed, but they were kept back. Jack arrived on the scene with Mark and Linda shortly after, hearts pounding. He spotted Nancy being examined by an EMT. The look in her eyes when she saw them made him feel like the ground vanished under his feet. She stumbled toward Jack, arms outstretched, her entire frame trembling. "Jack!" she cried, her voice cracking. He wrapped her in a hug, holding her so tight that the paramedic had to remind him not to squeeze too firmly. She sobbed against his chest, the dam of terror, exhaustion, and relief finally bursting. Mark and Linda joined, forming a protective circle around her. In that moment, under the purpling sky, Nancy finally realized Daniel Carter was no longer an ominous shadow in her life. He was dead, and she was free. The aftermath felt surreal. The authorities confirmed that Daniel was gone, removing the final threat that had hung over Nancy. The next few days were spent ensuring she received medical checkups, therapy, and whatever support she needed. The entire town breathed a collective sigh of relief, though the tragedy of Sarah's fate and the damage Daniel had wrought remained a bitter pill. Jack stopped by every day, cooking simple meals for the Whitmans, offering any comfort he could. Nancy wouldn't let him out of her sight at first, fearful that he too might vanish. Over time, that raw terror eased, replaced by a slow, cautious hope. Nancy resumed her therapy, but now the nightmares that had once featured her father lurking in the shadows dissipated, replaced by a sense of finality. There was an emptiness, a mourning for the mother she had lost, but also a resolute determination to live. Jack watched her paint a new canvas one afternoon, a bright image of a small house by a lake, with a flower garden in full bloom. She turned to him, looking shy. "Do you like it?" she asked. He smiled gently. "It's beautiful. Does it make you feel good to draw places like that?" She nodded. "It's how I imagine somewhere safe and happy." "That's exactly what I see too," he said. Brookhaven eventually returned to its calm routines, but the people there never forgot Nancy's ordeal. She became a symbol of resilience and survival, a young girl who had faced down unimaginable darkness. In those final weeks of summer, Nancy spent most of her days close to home, regaining her sense of security. The Whitmans arranged a small get-together with close friends and neighbors, celebrating the end of her captivity and Daniel's final defeat. Jack arrived with a homemade cake, sporting a bashful grin as Nancy rushed up to greet him. "Hey kiddo," he said gently, looking at her with fondness. She smirked. "I'm not a kid. I'm 11 now," she joked, referencing her birthday, which had passed quietly during a turbulent time. He laughed softly, nodding. Later that evening, Nancy gazed around at the small circle of people who loved her. Linda and Mark, who had pledged to be her parents and guardians forever. Mrs. Bennet, standing with a warm smile, proud of the child she had once helped in a crisis. Sergeant Jenkins, who had done everything in his power to keep her safe. And Jack, the solitary man whose life had changed the moment she ran into his shop. She felt gratitude swell in her chest. "Thank you, everyone," she said softly. "I know it's not over. I still feel bad sometimes. But I'm so thankful for all of you." They assured her that the healing process took time, and that she would never have to face anything alone again. At the end of the evening, Jack was preparing to head home, and Nancy pulled him aside for a moment. She opened her mouth, trying to find the right words, then simply wrapped her arms around him. He held her, returning the hug with quiet emotion. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. "I'll always be here." She nodded against his chest. "I know." In the months that followed, Nancy continued therapy, weaving together the threads of her life with the unwavering support of her adoptive family and Jack. She developed new friendships at school, even signed up for an after-school art club. The nightmares receded, replaced by cautious optimism and, sometimes, a hesitant smile that hinted at genuine happiness. She began to talk about future plans, maybe going to an art college one day. She still carried the scars of her past, both visible and invisible, but she no longer lived in the shadow of her father's violence. Jack, too, found that his life took on new meaning. He remodeled part of his store, adding a small corner with comfortable chairs where people could sit, chat, or read. He reached out more to the community. Folks noticed he seemed less burdened, more open to conversation. He formed a deeper friendship with Mark and Linda, and they often invited him for dinner. Sometimes, as they talked late into the night, they reflected on how a single harrowing event had drawn them together, forging bonds that felt like family. For Nancy, who had lost so much, the sense of having multiple caring adults in her life was priceless. One crisp fall morning, Nancy returned to the place where it had all begun, Jack's shop. She was with Linda, who needed to pick up a few items. The bell jingled over the door, and Jack looked up from behind the counter, a flood of emotions crossing his face. Nancy wandered the aisles that now looked familiar yet somehow smaller. She remembered the terror that had once driven her here, but she felt calm. Jack observed how much she had grown, not just in height but in spirit. Her posture was more confident, her eyes no longer darting around in fear. Linda approached the counter, placing a basket of groceries down. Nancy followed, holding a pack of pencils and sketch paper. She set them gently on the counter. "Do you remember when I first came in here?" she asked Jack. He nodded. "I'll never forget." She paused, her gaze drifting around the shelves. "I was so scared. Now it feels like it happened to someone else. But I know it was me. It's just hard to explain." "I understand," Jack said quietly. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Her lips curled into a small smile. "Thanks." Linda paid for the groceries, and the three of them chatted for a moment. As Nancy tucked the pencils under her arm, she glanced at the front window, noticing her reflection next to Jack's. She felt a surge of gratitude, an awareness that if she hadn't run into this shop that day, her story might have had a very different ending. She turned and gave him a firm hug across the counter. He returned it, feeling the warmth in his chest, a stark contrast to the cold fear of that first encounter. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Nancy whispered. "Thank you for being my friend." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Always." It was shortly after that day that Nancy decided to create a large painting, a gift for Jack, the Whitmans, Mrs. Bennet, and Sergeant Jenkins. She painted a scene of Brookhaven's Main Street, its quaint shops and lampposts, sunlight streaming onto the pavement. At the center, she depicted small silhouettes of the people who had saved her. It was a testament to the power of compassion and courage. When she finally presented it to them in an informal gathering at the local community center, the reactions were emotional. Tears shimmered in Linda's eyes, while Mark patted Nancy's shoulder with fatherly pride. Mrs. Bennet's lips quivered as she praised Nancy's artistic talent. Sergeant Jenkins nodded solemnly, tipping his hat. Jack stood quietly, cradling the painting in his arms as though it might slip away. He thought of all the hardships and heartbreak that had led to this moment of beauty. Nancy brushed away a tear, her gaze flicking around at the people who had become her extended family. "I wanted to show you what Brookhaven feels like in my heart now," she said softly. "It's not scary anymore." A gentle applause filled the small space. Jack approached Nancy, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "You've given everyone here a gift by showing us the way you see the world." She offered a genuine smile, for once not overshadowed by lingering fear. "I think I see it differently now. Better." Time moved forward in that subtle, unstoppable way that heals wounds and shifts burdens. Nancy's life settled into a rhythm of school, art club, therapy, and weekends spent with friends, things normal for a girl her age, but previously unimaginable under the specter of Daniel's brutality. The memory of her ordeal was still present, but not as an all-consuming terror. Instead, it became a chapter in her story, something that shaped her but did not define her. Jack watched her flourish with pride, quietly cheering her on from his place behind the counter or across the Whitman family's dinner table. Whenever reporters tried to bring up the tragedy, hoping for sensational updates, Nancy's family shielded her. The only time she agreed to speak publicly was at a small child welfare awareness event, where she mentioned how important it was for anyone experiencing abuse to speak out and find help, just as she had done when she ran into Jack's shop. Her words resonated with others, especially those who recognized how easily abuse can remain hidden until it's nearly too late. Nancy was no longer just a victim or a survivor. She was an advocate in her own right, albeit a young one with a powerful story. As more seasons passed, Nancy's therapy sessions decreased in frequency. She started focusing more on friends, developing a close-knit circle at school. She wasn't the quiet, frightened girl she had been before. She had learned boundaries and self-confidence, though occasional panic attacks reminded her of the past. Each time, she handled them with newfound tools and the unwavering support of her family and Jack. Still, there were nights when she'd call Jack, her voice trembling just slightly as she said, "I had a bad dream," or "something reminded me of that cabin," and he would talk her through it, gently reminding her that she was safe. He'd tell her stories of small wonders he noticed around Brookhaven or a funny incident at his shop to distract her until she was calm enough to sleep again. The years began to slip by, bringing Nancy into her early teens. Brookhaven witnessed the physical transformation of a girl who had once been small and frightened growing taller, more self-assured. Jack's own transformation was subtler. He welcomed more connections into his life, making friends with neighbors, playing in a casual softball league on weekends, discovering that the quiet life he once prized was even richer when shared. The bond between him and Nancy never wavered. It matured as she grew from a child to a confident adolescent. Eventually, Nancy's art started drawing attention. Her high school art teacher saw her potential and helped her enroll in a regional arts competition. She won third prize with a stirring piece titled "Hope in the Darkness," featuring a girl standing at the entrance of a long tunnel, sunlight spilling in behind her. Linda and Mark were beyond proud, and Jack, though never one to shout about accomplishments, beamed quietly. The little girl who had once stumbled into his shop, broken and terrified, was finding her voice through colors and brushstrokes. Of course, the memory of Daniel Carter and all the suffering he inflicted remained a painful part of Nancy's history. She sometimes asked difficult questions. Did he ever love me? Or what if things had been different? Linda or Mark would hold her, and Jack would remind her that her father's cruelty was not her fault. Over time, Nancy came to accept that sometimes people do terrible things that cannot be fully explained. She found that acceptance didn't mean forgetting or forgiving. It meant refusing to let the past consume her. Those who followed Nancy's life from the sidelines, Mrs. Bennett, Sergeant Jenkins, Karen Vogel, the social worker, marveled at her resilience. They supported her quietly, celebrating milestones like her birthdays and achievements at school. Jenkins would occasionally stop by Jack's shop for a cup of coffee, remarking, "You did a great thing for that girl," and Jack would modestly shake his head, saying, "She did it for herself. I was just here." Though everything seemed on a path of serene recovery, There was one more important day that stood out above all others: the official adoption ceremony in which Nancy took the Whitman name legally. It was a small gathering in a humble courtroom, presided over by a friendly judge who asked Nancy if she truly wanted Mark and Linda to be her parents. She nodded eagerly, tears in her eyes. The sense of finality and belonging was overwhelming. She was no longer Nancy Porter, a child of fear and heartbreak, but Nancy Whitman, a girl with a future and a family who adored her. After the ceremony, they all went out for ice cream, Jack included, and Nancy spent the entire evening grinning like she had never grinned before. In the months after the adoption, Nancy's nightmares about her father nearly stopped. There were still occasional flashbacks, triggered by certain sounds or smells, but they were infrequent. Therapy gave her strategies to cope. Linda sat with her at bedtime, stroking her hair, Mark helped with her art projects, and Jack maintained his steadfast role as a quiet guardian. Every time she saw him, she'd flash him a smile that spoke of gratitude and a shared history only they truly understood. Eventually, she spoke of wanting to help other kids who had gone through trauma. She told Jack, "I think I want to volunteer someday, or maybe become a counselor or an artist who tells stories that can help people feel strong. I don't want everything that happened to me to just be darkness." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes warm with approval. "That's a wonderful idea," he said. "I believe you can do it." In the end, the haunting chapter of Daniel Carter's escape, Nancy's abduction, and his subsequent death existed like a dark scar, reminding everyone of how precarious life could be and how crucial it was to stand by those in need. But the years that followed testified to something greater: the enduring power of love and compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. Nancy carried that lesson forward, embodying it in her bright, hopeful paintings. By the time she reached her mid-teens, she was telling the story on her own terms, selectively, when she felt safe and when she thought it might help someone else find the courage to speak up about abuse or danger. She never forgot that day she rushed into Jack's shop, trembling and desperate. But she could now recall it without falling into despair. It stood as a pivotal moment where her path diverged from tragedy into the possibility of rescue and renewal. Late on a spring afternoon, Jack locked up his shop and strolled over to the Whitmans' home. A warm breeze carried the scent of lilacs. Nancy was in the yard, painting a new masterpiece on an easel, the setting sun illuminating her hair. Jack approached quietly, watching the confident strokes of her brush. She glanced over her shoulder, smiling as he drew near. "Hi, Jack," she said brightly. "I'm almost done. What do you think?" He peered at the canvas. She had painted a scene of Brookhaven's Main Street, reminiscent of her earlier gift, but this time with more color and detail. The corner shop stood prominently, filled with golden light spilling out onto the sidewalk. A small figure of a girl peered through the window, and an older man stood behind the counter, an aura of kindness around him. "It's beautiful," he replied softly, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I love how you always seem to find the light in any scene." She smiled, a touch of humility in her eyes. "That's how I see it now. There's always light somewhere, even when it feels really dark." "That's a good perspective," Jack said, stepping back to admire her work. The quiet hush of the suburban street, the glow of the late afternoon, and the comfortable closeness between them, all of it felt like a testament to how far they had come. Nancy put down her brush, wiping her hands on a rag. "I remember when I was too scared to even look at the windows or go outside. Now I'm painting them." Jack nodded, recalling the day she had once shaken uncontrollably while waiting for him to lock the door. "You've grown a lot," he said. "You're stronger than you know." She tilted her head, considering his words. "I guess I am," she said. "But I couldn't have done it alone." He looked at her with an unspoken gratitude in his expression. "I think we all helped each other in different ways." Nancy didn't reply, but her smile said enough. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in rich shades of pink and orange. Soon, Linda would call them in for dinner. Mark would crack a joke about how hungry he was, and they would sit around the table sharing stories of the day. And in that comfortable domestic atmosphere, the once lonely shopkeeper and the once terrified girl would, if only briefly, reflect on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this place of healing. Nancy sometimes mentioned that she wanted to host an art exhibition in the future, maybe in a year or two. She wanted to showcase the progression of her artworks from when she was 10 and traumatized to her current blossoming style. Jack encouraged her, offering the store's front window as a small gallery if she ever wanted a local preview. She lit up at the idea, and Linda and Mark vowed to support her with whatever resources she needed. As summer approached again, the town of Brookhaven finally felt at ease, unburdened by the dark headlines of the previous years. Nancy's story, while tragic, had morphed into a narrative of hope and new beginnings. Jack found that he too had changed. He was no longer the quiet loner. He had become a man who understood that forging connections could bring purpose to life. In Nancy's young eyes, Jack saw a future where she would grow into a confident adult, but the memory of her mother's fate would drive her to protect others in need. From the vantage of time, it was clear that compassion had altered the course of both their lives. What began as a desperate plea in a small-town shop led to an unbreakable bond between two people who thought they had little to offer the world, yet in each other, they found a reason to keep faith in humanity's capacity for kindness. And in that faith lay the promise that no matter how deep the shadows of fear and loss, light could shine through, illuminating a path forward. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.